Okay, thanks so much for joining and for listening to today's webinar. My name is John Noonan. I'm a member of LogicWorks product team, and today we're going to be discussing the top 5 reasons that AWS customers fail compliance. So let's start with a little bit about LogicWorks. We are the leader in compliant cloud services for AWS, Azure, and hybrid cloud. We have over 25 years experience serving hundreds of customers in regulated industries like healthcare, financial services, and SaaS. Compliance is a particular specialty of ours. We undergo 6 annual third-party audits. We're certified in HIPAA, HITRUST, SOC 1 and 2, as well as PCI. And our services really cover the entire cloud journey. So starting with migration, we have services that will deep dive into your current application needs and business goals and provide you with an assessment. We have a service that will actually design a cloud environment for your organization, and even taking it to the next level, we can actually build that environment on behalf of our customers. For the cloud operations realm, we offer 24/7 support, incident management, and we also monitor for issues and best practices that we've learned as a company through our LogicWorks Pulse platform. And then finally, we have cloud optimization, and the services here would be things like DevOps implementation, cost optimization, and particularly relevant to this webinar is a cloud compliance assessment. So let's start with some pretty interesting facts about compliance in the cloud. During a survey conducted this year, 3/4 of IT decision makers noted the increased regulatory complexity that goes along with cloud adoption. And in that same study, over a half of the people surveyed also believed that their organizations did not have a proactive approach when it comes to compliance. So that, if compliance is such a challenge, that raises a few questions. Like, why is it such a challenge? How can organizations be more proactive? And if they decide to do so, what types of actions can they take? So in this webinar, we're really going to explore some of those challenges around cloud compliance. We're going to take a look at the top 5 reasons based on our experience that companies fail AWS compliance, and also highlight a few steps and best practices that organizations can take to tackle those challenges and be proactive. All right, so let's take a look at the top 5 reasons that companies fail AWS compliance. The first one is very common, but it's assuming that cloud platforms are responsible for compliance. And a lot of this stems from a lack of understanding around the shared responsibility model. And we'll get into that in a further slide. The second is failing to map compliance regulations to actual cloud count and instance configurations. So taking the sometimes broader compliance rules and mapping them to your actual cloud settings. The third is failing to implement basic security best practices. So basic security best practices, things like encryption and MFA, they can go a really long way to help check a number of the boxes needed for compliance. The fourth reason is taking a manual approach to compliance, not utilizing a lot of the tools that are available to companies to do their due diligence when it comes to compliance. And the fifth reason is not regularly assessing compliance. So compliance is really an ongoing commitment. It shouldn't be treated like something that could be accomplished and then organizations turn their energies elsewhere. All right, so let's take a look at the first reason that companies fail AWS compliance. So reason one is assuming that cloud providers are responsible for compliance. And if you look at the stat here, it's pretty alarming, but almost 70% of companies believe that they can place all responsibility for compliance on the cloud provider. And that's just simply not true. Compliance in the cloud really requires a new way of thinking. So traditional thinking in an on-prem environment things are much more black and white. Organizations, physically own the resources that they're using, and they're responsible, end to end for maintaining compliance. But a cloud environment adds a new level of complexity, and responsibility isn't as clear because customers are using resources and hardware that they don't actually physically own. So this leads to some misconceptions. One would be that just because a service is offered in the cloud, so something like encryption, just because it's offered, a lot of times customers think that it's by default set up, and that's really not the case. So customers are responsible for account and instance configurations and following all security and compliance regulations and best practices. So one thing that's really important to note is that AWS is responsible for the physical security and availability of cloud services, and really everything else is the responsibility of the customer, and we're going to explore that a bit more. So in order to help clarify things, AWS has developed what we call the shared responsibility model, and they've publicized a really simple and effective motto. And that says that AWS is responsible for the security of the cloud, while the customer is responsible for security in the cloud. So what does that mean? That really means that AWS is just responsible for the physical security of those resources and for keeping those services up and running and secure. Whereas the customer is responsible for just about everything else. So things like protecting their data through encryption, identity and access management, operating system hardening and patching, network traffic protection, firewalls, and just about everything else that goes along with actually utilizing those resources that are coming from the cloud provider. So, we have this issue. What are some best practices or steps that can be taken to address them? So, one thing that we find really effective is to understand and analyze your environment, understand and analyze your compliance rules, and create some type of responsibility matrix. So what that does is it takes a deep look into the compliance rules, clearly lays out the stakeholders, and then identifies primary responsibility for each compliance control. So for the example above, this is an actual responsibility matrix from a LogicWorks PCI compliant client, and it identifies the actual PCI DSS rules and then clearly lays out who is accountable, who is responsible, who is informed, and who is consulted for actions related to each PCI rule. And we found this to be and our customers have also found this to be a very effective best practice. So let's look at reason number 2 that companies fail AWS compliance. That is because they don't successfully map the control to a specific action. So often controls seem really broad or really simple, and it's difficult to map them to actual settings and configurations and actions. So an example of that is ISO 27002 has a rule, I think it's 12.1, around technical vulnerability management. But what does that actually mean, when you're spinning up instances and setting up your cloud account? So it means things like don't allow SSH connections with empty passwords and disabling guest account access to your resources. There are really a vast number of configurations for a customer's AWS account and instances, and they all need to be understood in the context of compliance controls. And this disconnect is actually a key reason for compliance failure. So how would an organization address this? There are a few ways to go about it. One is taking the upfront time to analyze and write down the actual controls. The second is to purchase a list of cloud controls for the compliance framework that an organization is adhering to. And the third is to seek expertise from a third party. The next reason is kind of a alarming one, but it's also surprisingly true, and that is just failing to meet basic security requirements and best practices. So many companies fall out of compliance simply because they're not following best practices. Best practices are things like rotating passwords, patching your operating system, using encryption, and really just doing everything you can to harden your environment. So a lot of times I think organizations get caught up in the nitty-gritty and they sometimes just forget the big general best practices. And hardening your environment by following these best practices not only will it put your organization in a better place, but it also checks a lot of the boxes for your next compliance audit. So how do you meet those basic security requirements? If you're looking for a place to start, the CIS benchmarks provide a really clear and comprehensive list of things that really any IT organization should be doing or cloud organization should be doing to harden their environment. All right, so step 4 is also very common, and that is because companies often take a manual approach to compliance. And this is a really common pitfall, despite, and you'll see on the fact here, that over 2/3 of IT leaders would actually prefer an automated approach to IT compliance. So, there's so much enthusiasm around taking an automated approach. Why do organizations often take a manual approach? I think because there's less effort up front. A lot of the times it's easier in the short term, and organizations really aren't sure which steps they should take and how they can automate. But the manual approach actually ends up creating more work in the long term. It can create kind of a mess out of your compliance situation. It's also significantly more error prone. It's a lot slower to implement. And often changes in configurations can't be reversed if needed. Conversely, there are a ton of benefits to automation. Automation allows for actual changes to code, not to individual servers, which really enables quick, repeatable compliance and security configurations in cloud environments. And it also goes a long way to ensure that each instance is configured in the same way, which will prevent a situation where you may be compliant in one of your instances or in one of your cloud resources, but not across your entire environment. So what are some examples of ways that companies can automate compliance? One is by utilizing templates. So templates enable replication of cloud resources across your cloud account, and they allow for really consistent settings and controls. So examples of templates would be things like CloudFormation and Terraform. The second is configuration management, and similar to templates, these allow for consistent configurations of your instances and your operating systems, and they allow for replication and management of settings across multiple resources. So examples of these that would be commonly known are things like Puppet, Chef, and Ansible. And finally, a very important one is scanning. And scanning often utilizes machine learning. It can really quickly check hundreds or thousands of configurations of AWS accounts, instances, and operating systems. And it's a really powerful way to really dig into your infrastructure. So examples of these are things like Amazon Macie, AWS Config, and LogicWorks DLP. So let's look at the final reason why companies fail AWS compliance, and that reason is they neglect to regularly assess compliance. So I think there's often a false assumption that once an audit is passed, compliance is achieved, and organizations can move their time and effort elsewhere. But that's really not the case. If you look at the quote above, almost 45% of companies fall out of PCI DSS compliance within 9 months of validation. So that's a pretty alarming stat. And what it shows is that compliance is really a moving target. It requires continual work, and it's something that organizations have to remain diligent about. So one way to address this challenge is LogicWorks recommends a compliance assessment at least every 6 to 8 months. And that'll really enable organizations to maintain compliance in an ever-changing world of cloud computing. Okay, so we covered the top 5 reasons for compliance failure. Now we'll get into how LogicWorks can help. So we have a compliance assessment, and it really empowers customers to benchmark where they stand in terms of compliance and security, to demonstrate their following security and compliance best practices, and also to identify gaps for remediation, so to see where they're struggling and what they need to do to improve their compliance posture. So this compliance assessment starts with a scan that uses agentless software and auto-discovers a customer's AWS environment. That point-in-time scan looks at their account and instances and will flag security and compliance issues on behalf of the customer. And those issues are also mapped back to actual compliance framework rules. So once the scan's run, LogicWorks team of cloud and compliance experts will analyze and interpret those findings, and those findings will be shared with customers both as a full findings document as well as an easy to understand board level report that basically summarizes what the findings were, shows top issues by category, and goes into things like that. And then we also offer the option to have LogicWorks team help with the actual remediation work. So you can go from finding issues, understanding the gaps, through to actually improving your compliance posture. Okay, so what does this scan cover? It covers all the major compliance frameworks, general regulations, and industry guidelines. The assessment is available for AWS and Azure environments, and it looks for things like issues in the console and account settings, so things like MFA being off, not strong enough password settings, auditing not being set up. It also looks for networking, so things like ports being open, authentication, and identity access management. It goes really deep into the operating system settings as well as hardening, covers encryption, logs, firewall policies, and even more. So after the scan and the analysis, LogicWorks compliance assessment provides customers with 2 actual outputs. So one is a comprehensive board level compliance report. This is a really powerful tool to understand where you stand in terms of compliance. So you get a 0 to 100 score of their environment, and the report breaks down risk by framework and operating system, summarizes the types of issues that are found. So for example, if a customer had a lot of issues in monitoring or networking, or if password policies were a main driver of poor performance, that will be identified. The report also lists the most critical issues uncovered and provides the top steps for impactful remediation. So along with that board level report, we also provide our customers with the full findings uncovered by the scan. So this compliance assessment is a really powerful tool for organizations on the cloud that may be responsible for compliance frameworks like PCI DSS, HIPAA, or SOC 2, or for organizations that are just looking to ensure that they're following best practices and guidelines like CIS. And it's a great way to be proactive and to stay ahead of many of the challenges that we just discussed. Okay, that brings us to the end of our webinar. Thank you for your time and for your interest. If you're interested in how LogicWorks can help your organization remain compliant or would like a compliance assessment, please contact sales@logicworks.com.